I'm Professor Fred Krantz. I'm director of the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research. We are doing number 8 in our series of Isralerts today, which is March 4th, 2013. And our topic today will be the crisis in Syria and its more general implications. As you know, the new American Secretary of State, John Kerry, has been in the region, and he met with members of the Syrian Council, the newly formed coalition council, in Rome. And he announced a shift in American policy, which is to give more direct aid to the Syrian rebels, Syrian opposition, in their struggle with the Assad regime. However, he made it very clear that this did not include weapons. It included civilian help, supplies, even bulletproof vests, but no weapons. And the fear he articulated was that weapons would get into the hands of the Islamists, the radicals who are fighting with the rebels against the regime. So American policy, foreign policy, hasn't changed in the last 2 years. And the Europeans generally follow the American lead. The Europeans have an arms embargo on Syria, which means, in effect, that it works against the rebels, since the Assad regime is supplied by Russia and by Iran. And the rebels are not being supplied directly by anybody, although they get support from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. The situation there is a disaster. It is a full-blown civil war now. Over 70,000 people, by conservative estimate, have died, most of them civilians, in the struggle so far. There are 1 million external refugees in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey. There are over 2 million refugees displaced within Syria itself. The city of Aleppo, the biggest city in Syria, has been largely wrecked by fighting and by the use of artillery and tank bombardments and even airplanes, of course. And now the Assad regime is using Scud missiles against the rebels and bombing civilian neighborhoods in an attempt to bludgeon the people into acquiescence. And it will only get worse. There is great fear, of course, over the chemical and biological weapons stores, which the regime has, and which in recent weeks there's been seen by satellite some activity in these areas, and the American President Obama has announced it is his one red line when it comes to the Syrian situation, that if the Assad regime were to use chemical biological weapons against the population, then the Americans would immediately enter the fray on the side of the rebels. But that might be rather too late, of course. So Syria today is what Thomas Hobbes wrote about in England in the 17th century, during the long and bloody English Civil War. Hobbes said in his great work Leviathan that the Civil War replicated what he called a state of nature. And the state of nature was a bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all. And that is what we are seeing in Syria, and there are no indications that the British and the French take the initiative. In Libya, there's been no leading whatsoever. This is true generally of the Arab Spring, of which the Syrian situation is a part, or at least influenced by the Arab Spring. The American president, increasingly neo-isolationist, it's becoming very clear since his re-election, doesn't intervene, and not to intervene means, in terms of the Arab Spring, and increasingly in Syria, allowing the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the al-Qaeda-oriented Islamists in other areas, the Jabhat al-Nusra militia in Syria, which is increasingly important militarily, which is funded by Salafi elements from Saudi Arabia, and which is connected to al-Qaeda. So the region is devolving into more and more disorder and violence. And the Americans are more and more concerned with their internal problems, as per the current sequester. This is not a good omen for the general situation in the region, nor for the relation of Israel to what is going on in her neighborhood. The Israeli concern, above all, of course, is with Iran. And insofar as Iran is concerned, once again we see the results of a kind of American hands-off position, despite the sanctions which are being imposed. But the sanctions are a kind of substitute for direct politics, and they are not preventing the mullah regime in Tehran from making more and more strides, more and more advances towards possession of a weapon. A nuclear breakout in the Iranian circumstance now looks to be within 6 months, if not sooner. And that will create a great crisis insofar as Israel is concerned. So America has become a question mark in an area where formerly she exercised great influence. The absence of a major superpower is making itself felt everywhere, from Egypt to Libya to Syria and beyond. American budget cuts, which were hitting the military with great specificity, $500 billion in cuts prior to the sequestration. Now the sequestration, 50% of which half of 85 billion, to come out of the military. And of course we now have a Secretary of Defense, Hagel, who did not distinguish himself in the hearings, who seems to be clearly, if not anti-Israel, at least not enthusiastic about Israel, and certainly pliable insofar as cutting the defense budget is concerned, which is why Obama appointed him in the first place. So to paraphrase the old adage, and to close today's Isralert, whom the gods would destroy, they first make isolationist. Obama may think he can ignore the rise of Islamists everywhere, turning away from the Middle East to focus on domestic problems. But given the instability of the region and its capacity for surprise and its rulers' contempt for weakness, Obama may be rudely surprised by what lays in wait. As another aphorism has it, you may not be interested in history, Mr. President, but it is interested in you. Thank you very much. See you next week.